Good evening, Canada, and welcome to, or should I say good morning here in Australia. Welcome to the Adelaide Law School. My name is Paul Babby. I'm one of the professors in the Adelaide Law School. I'm Associate Dean of the Law School for the area of research, and I'm also the Director of the Canadian Law Admissions Program for the Adelaide Law School. Tonight, what we want to do is, or what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about the Adelaide Law School, a little bit about the admissions process for those Canadians that are hoping to study at the Adelaide Law School, and then to open things up for any questions that you might have. So first, a little bit about the Adelaide Law School, and I could start actually with the University of Adelaide. The University of Adelaide is one of the oldest universities in Australia, and it's also a member of what's known as the Group of 8 Universities of Australia. And the Group of 8 Universities of Australia are the most research-intensive and comprehensively educational institutions in Australia. So we are amongst the very best universities in Australia, and indeed we're one of the better universities in the world as well. We have a student body at the University of Adelaide of about 25,000 students at any one time, and the Adelaide Law School operates within that institution. The Adelaide Law School, again, is one of the oldest law schools in Australia, and we have about 1,500 or 1,600 students at any one time. We were, or are ranked, I should say, consistently on the QS World Rankings of law schools. Consistently from 2011 to 2013, we've been ranked in the top 100 law schools in Australia. And if you were to compare us then with other law schools in Canada that were comparably ranked on the QS World Ranking of law schools, you'd find that we are in the same band as law schools in Canada, such as Osgoode Hall and the University of Alberta. So we're amongst the very best law schools in Canada in terms of our ranking. If you were to compare us to other Australian law schools, again, we are ranked amongst the very best, indeed probably within the top 7 law schools in Australia. Recently, the Australian government conducted an assessment of the research output of all universities across Australia, and in relation to law, the Adelaide Law School was ranked in the top 7 law schools in Australia. And so we are amongst the very best law schools in Australia, and as I say, we are in the top 100 law schools in the world as well. We have a number of leading international experts in various areas of law, including public law and private law in relation to constitutional and administrative law, in relation to property law and torts. And so our academics at the Adelaide Law School are some of the leading experts in their fields in Australia, and indeed, as I've already said, in the world as well. Now, in terms of admission to the Adelaide Law School for Canadians, what we have done is set aside a small quota of seats, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 students per year from Canada. And for those students that are going to be joining us from Canada, the most important thing to remember about our admission process for Canadian students, and indeed for all law students studying at the Adelaide Law School, is that the LSAT is not a requirement of entrance into the study of law. Indeed, not only is that true at the Adelaide Law School, but it's also true of all Australian law schools. The LSAT is not a requirement of admission into the law school. So that is something that I know will be of interest to Canadian students. I've traveled through Canada on a number of occasions speaking to students hoping to study at the Adelaide Law School, and that is one of the most significant questions that they raise, is what is the extent to which the LSAT is taken into account for our admissions process. Well, I can tell you that the LSAT is not something that we require for your admission. So indeed, you would not even need to write the LSAT in order to study law at the Adelaide Law School. Again, as I said, we have a quota for the number of Canadians that we'll be accepting to study law at the Adelaide Law School, and for that number, for the Canadian students who apply to us, what we're looking at is for essentially a student to have a GPA of somewhere around 2.8, I should say, to 3.0, or 70%. Entrance into the Adelaide Law School for Australian students is quite competitive. Indeed, for an Australian seeking to study at our law school, it would be as competitive as a Canadian attempting to gain entry to a Canadian law school. But for the quota of Canadian students, we have taken a different approach, and therefore we have that GPA of 2.8 to 3.0, or 70%, and as I've already said, the LSAT is not required. Now, the next important question that is raised by every Canadian that I've spoken to about studying law in Australia, or in fact studying law outside of Canada, is the question of how will a transition be made in terms of returning to Canada to practice law. There are established pathways to return to the practice of law in Canada. Those pathways will be administered by what is known as the National Committee on Accreditation of the Federation of Canadian Law Societies. And so what happens is that the National Committee on Accreditation, or the NCA, does not actually accredit institutions, so it's not a case of the Adelaide Law School being accredited by the NCA, but rather it is a case of accrediting individuals. So what occurs with any Canadian studying law outside of Canada is that they study at their institution, whether it be in Australia or the UK or some other country outside of Canada, and when they've completed their law studies, they will then submit an application to the National Committee on Accreditation, and that application will be considered by the NCA, and what typically occurs is that the NCA will determine that those students who have studied outside of Canada will have some exams usually to write in order to return to Canada. So there are a number of ways that can be accomplished. Either the exams can be written, or the subjects which the NCA requires the student to take can be taken at one of the Canadian law schools, which offers those subjects to Canadians who have studied outside of Canada. But as I say, if a student chooses to write the exams in order to satisfy the NCA requirements, then those exams are usually possible to complete within about 6 months of your returning to Canada. So in total, it may add an additional 6 months onto your total study plan, but depending on how much time you might save in terms of entering the Adelaide Law School earlier than you would be in a position to enter a Canadian law school, then certainly you may end up finishing almost exactly as would one of your Canadian colleagues who studies at a Canadian law school. So there are established pathways to return to practice. In fact, obviously, we wouldn't be talking to you now if there wasn't a possibility for you to return to Canada to practice law once you had finished studying here at the Adelaide Law School. The other question that tends to arise, obviously, is the issue of fees. There are, I guess the first thing that I could say is that the fees are somewhere in the neighborhood of $28,000 per year for a Canadian student who would be studying at the Adelaide Law School. And those fees, given that the parity of the Australian dollar to the Canadian dollar is almost virtually on par at the moment, then that's pretty similar to the fees that you'd be expected to pay in Canadian dollars. That is competitive with the better Canadian law schools, so we are not that much outside of the sorts of fees that you'd expect to pay at one of the Canadian law schools. There are a number of considerations to take account of in relation to your expenses while you'd be studying in Australia and in Adelaide. One of the first things that I can say is that Adelaide is a city of about 1.2 or 1.3 million people, so it's comparable in size to places like Calgary and Edmonton, but in fact the cost of living is somewhat better than some of the larger cities in Canada, such as Vancouver or Toronto. So the sort of cost of living that you'd be expecting to deal with if you were studying in Adelaide would be similar to a Canadian city such as Edmonton. And certainly if you have an interest in talking further about the living expenses and your weekly expenses and monthly expenses when you're studying at the Adelaide Law School, I'd be happy to do that. There are also, in terms of housing or accommodation, possibilities. There are a number of housing and accommodation possibilities. And those, again, we can put you in touch with the appropriate office here in the university in order to determine what those options might be. But there is certainly a range of options available to you. The other thing that I should have mentioned, of course, in relation to the tuition fees is that there is assistance that is available from most provincial student funding bodies. What you would need to do is contact your provincial funding body to determine what level of funding would be available for you to study overseas. But there is certainly some funding that is available for those students studying overseas. Additionally, the Canada Student Loan Program is also available to those students who will be studying outside of Canada. Again, both of those you would need to contact both the Canada Student Loan Program and your provincial student loan body in order to determine what the level of assistance would be. I should also say that our agent in Canada, as you would be no doubt aware at this stage, given the fact that you're now logged on to this webinar, is KOM Consultants. They will be very happy to assist you with any questions you might have, in particular the application process and the issue of funding and what might be available for you to study at the Adelaide Law School. So at that stage, I might open it up to questions. I have I don't seem to have any questions yet. Yes, we have some people logged in with us, but there's no questions at this stage. Yes, okay, sorry, I do have a question now. The question was, are there any scholarships available? Yes, sorry, I should have said that at this stage also, again, for our Canadian students, we will have a limited number of what we refer to as startup scholarships, which will be available. Those will be $5,000. Those will still be available for those students who are entering in the 2014 academic year, which leads me on to another point, which is that our academic year, and so I'm glad that somebody asked me the question about scholarships, because in talking about the scholarships, the Canadian Startup Scholarships of $5,000, that's reminded me to discuss the issue of the academic year. Our academic year in Australia runs from about February each year, so our first semester. So if you thought about when you'd be starting in Canada, which would be late August or early September, well, the equivalent of that in Australia, given the change in terms of the seasons, our academic year begins in February each year. So if you were accepted at this stage to study with us, you'd be accepted for the class which was to begin in February 2014, and so those scholarships which are available would be available for those students entering in 2014. The other thing I wanted to say about the application process is that I know that some of you may still be waiting for indications from Canadian law schools. Our application process operates on a rolling basis, so you could apply to the Adelaide Law School at any time starting now, and we would be happy to receive applications from Canadian applicants up to the middle of January of 2014 for the class which would begin in February 2014. So there's plenty of time for you to apply, but the earlier that you apply, the earlier that we can consider your application and advise you as to the outcome. Again, in terms of the application, I just wanted to reiterate that it is KOM Consultants who you can contact, who will assist you in starting the application process, and they will walk you through all of the various steps in relation to that application process. So I do have another question. Do we have any seats set aside for citizens of the United States? We don't have a specific quota, but what we would probably do is certainly consider an applicant from the United States, and we would consider that applicant within the Canadian within our Canadian quota of 20 to 25 students. So we would certainly be happy to consider an application from someone from the United States. We would treat them the same in terms of GPA. Again, the LSAT would not be required. The only thing that I would have to say is that in terms of returning, if you wanted to return to the United States to practice law once you'd finished here, then it would be your responsibility to look into what those requirements would be. I do know that, of course, each state has its own requirements in the United States for the practice of law, so you would simply, and I would say that it would be a good idea to contact the state admissions body, depending on which state you wanted to return to, before you decided to study with us, but we would be happy to consider an application from you at any time, but to contact that state body to determine what might be required in terms of studying at an overseas law school before you're able to go back and practice there. The next question that we have is, again, returning to the scholarship issue, what are we looking for when applying for a scholarship? Well, basically, again, to go back to the criteria for the admission of Canadians to the Adelaide Law School, we'd still be looking for a GPA of 2.8 to 3.0 as the minimum, or around 70% is the minimum. There's also a statement that you would need to write indicating, sort of your background and what it is that you hope to be doing with a law degree. So certainly 2.8 to 3.0 would be the minimum, and that would allow you to be competitive, but again, there would be stronger competition for the scholarships. So GPA and a letter indicating your motivation for the study of law at the Adelaide Law School are the sorts of things that we would be looking for. And so those scholarships, as I've already said, would be $5,000 per student. The next question that I've received is, do we need to have a resume or reference letters as part of the application process? Well, in fact, we don't need to have references or a resume, although those things would be very helpful to us. So if you, obviously, I would expect that most of you would have a resume or a curriculum vitae, a CV, so by all means you could attach that to your application, but really all we're looking for is the completed application and of course your academic transcripts. Reference letters, again, would be something that would be helpful, but if you don't have those, it's not something that we're going to require in order for you to apply and be admitted to the Adelaide Law School. So yes, those things are helpful, but they're not required and not necessary. Okay, waiting now for the next question. Okay, we don't seem to have any further questions. I'll wait for a moment more. And perhaps while I'm waiting, I'll just say again, my name is Paul Bowdy. I'm one of the professors and associate dean at the Adelaide Law School, and the director of the Canadian Admissions Program for the Adelaide Law School. I've been speaking to a number of Canadian students over the past year and a half now, and I'm very happy to receive an email or a telephone call from anyone, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And in fact, we've had another question come in now, which is a question about articling in Canada. And the question is whether or not we assist with the articling process in Canada. No, I'm afraid that's something that we wouldn't actually, that we cannot provide assistance with. That's something that, again, as I was saying in response to the American question earlier, what I would recommend is that if you have a particular province that you're intending to practice law in, that you contact that the Law Society from that province before you start study with us, just to get a sense from them of what the law firms in that province, and then I would say to keep in touch with that Law Society and perhaps start to cultivate relationships with some of the law firms that you might be interested in articling with on your return, and then you can, that's the best way. I mean, I think that even Canadians studying law in Canada, that's the sort of thing that a lot of them are starting to do, is to develop that relationship with a particular law firm while they're doing their law studies, and there's no reason that an Australian couldn't do the same thing. So before someone was to come to us that was from Canada, I would suggest, as I say, getting in touch with that Provincial Law Society, and also start thinking about the sorts of firms you might be interested in, and cultivating those relationships with those law firms. And I'll wait again another moment. You can also contact KOM Consultants. They have a Canada Law brochure that we have prepared. They would be happy to send that to you, but you can also obtain that from our law school website. And you can get that information from the KOM Consultants webpage. Again, I just remind you that our class for 2014 begins in February 2014. We are accepting applications now. The application process is a rolling application process, so you can apply now. We will give you an outcome now, so you will have an idea of whether or not you're in a position to begin your studies in February, and we will continue to receive applications, or to take applications for both the law program and the $5,000 startup scholarships for Canadians up until the middle of January for our class, which begins in February 2014. So I'll wait one more moment to see if there's any further questions that may come through from anybody that had joined us today. And if there aren't, then I'll just reiterate, if you do have any questions and you didn't get a chance to ask them today, please do get in touch with me by email, and I'll be happy to get back to you straight away. And we can chat either by email or over the telephone. One other thing that I'll also mention is that I will be in Canada, traveling to a number of different universities in September. So if you would like to meet with me in person, I'd be happy to do that. The information about that, about the universities that I'll be visiting, will be available soon on the on the KOM Consultants website, or you can contact me and I can give you further information about that, and I'd be very happy to meet with you in September at your university in Canada. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing from you, and hopefully to meeting you in September, and I hope to welcoming you to the Adelaide Law School in February 2014. Thank you very much, and good night.